The battlefield was a haze of dust and trampled grass, horses screaming in panic, spear points flashing like shards of sun. Men fought so closely that the clang of metal was less like individual strikes and more like a continuous roar, like a river of iron. And somewhere in that vast chaos, a single arrow loosed from a frightened archer could end not only a man's life, but an entire kingdom's fate. And this is precisely why the king was not in the front. Yet for thousands of years, songs, myths, and legends told us that a true king led his men from the very first rank. The stories of Achilles, Alexander, and countless warrior kings paint a picture of rulers charging fearlessly into war, their armor gleaming at the front of the line. But reality, true historical reality, was far more complicated, much more fragile, and often brutally practical. That is the mystery we begin with today. Why didn't kings fight in the front lines? Why in civilizations across the world, from China to Mesopotamia, Egypt to medieval Europe, did rulers increasingly step away from personal combat and instead command from behind or even far from the battlefield? What changed? What calculations, political, social, economic, and deeply human, shaped this evolution? To understand this, we must journey back to the world in which kings lived. A world where the crown was not a symbol of luxury, but a burden of cosmic responsibility. Where losing a single life could topple generations. Where power could disappear as quickly as an unarmored king caught beneath the hooves of a charging cavalry. And so, our story begins not on the battlefield, but behind it. The life of a king, between silk and steel. To understand why rulers avoided frontline combat, we must first understand who these ancient kings really were. It is tempting to imagine a king as a warrior first, politician second. But for most of history, the duties of kingship were so vast, so intertwined with every aspect of society, that fighting, real, physical fighting, was only a tiny fragment of their role. Imagine waking up as an ancient king. Before sunrise, a team of attendants enters your chambers. Some roll open the heavy blinds of layered curtains. Some pour water over carved basins. Some begin preparing garments and jewelry chosen to reflect not your personal style, but your political image. Everything you wear, every object you touch, every person permitted near you communicates status, divine right, and authority. To be king was to be a living symbol. Even your breakfast, carefully prepared, painstakingly tested for poison, was not simply food. It was a ritual, a performance of abundance, a reminder to those who served you that the king's body was sacred, irreplaceable. Because a kingdom could survive without its strongest warrior. It could not survive without its ruler. The king as administrator. Though ancient rulers are often romanticized as heroic warriors, in truth, the bulk of their daily responsibilities were bureaucratic, administrative, and diplomatic. A king had to manage land distribution, oversee taxation and harvest collection, negotiate treaties, settle internal political disputes, preside over courts, maintain religious rituals, oversee infrastructure like canals, walls, and granaries, supervise the appointment of officials, maintain noble loyalty, manage succession. A king was the CEO of a kingdom, the chief judge, the high priest, and the public face of stability. If he died on the battlefield, the kingdom did not lose one man. It lost the central nervous system. Thus, kingship meant survival before valor. Opulence and isolation, the golden cage. The everyday life of a king was structured around preservation. From the food tasters to the layers of guards, from astrologers reading omens to physicians monitoring his vitals, a king lived in a tightly controlled world. He was surrounded by walls, guards, rituals, advisors, expectations, and most importantly, responsibilities. This life, while luxurious, was also isolating. A king rarely walked alone, rarely ate unobserved, rarely left his palace unwatched, and certainly rarely took unnecessary risks. Because even before a king faced external enemies, he faced internal ones. Assassination, poisoning, rebellion, coups. These were far more common dangers than foreign armies. A king whose death could create a power vacuum could not casually step into the whirlwind of battle where any stray spear could end his reign. Thus, kingship evolved into something profoundly defensive, not only because kings could not die, but because many different groups relied on the king to stay alive. The nobles, the priesthood, the bureaucrats, the merchants, the royal family, and sometimes even the foreign allies. In other words, too many people needed the king living to allow him to die gloriously. The good and the bad. Kingship as curse. The king lived surrounded by beauty, mosaics of gold, carved ivory, embroidered silks. But beneath that opulence lay immense pressure. The throne could elevate a man to divine status, but it also demanded constant vigilance. The good life of a king included enormous wealth, exclusive privileges, political power, luxury and comfort, access to the best education, art, and entertainment. But the bad included constant threats of assassination, political manipulation, the burden of public expectation, the fear of rebellion, the danger of military defeat, and the crushing weight of dynasty. A king's death didn't simply end a life, it could end an era. Many kings knew this intimately. Legendary rulers like Cyrus the Great, Julius Caesar, and countless others met violent ends, not always on battlefields, but at the hands of their own people. This shaped royal behavior profoundly, and it shaped how kings approached war. Why kings loved war, and why they feared it war, was essential to kingship. War brought land plunder, tribute slaves, prestige, political legitimacy. A king who never fought was often viewed as weak. In many societies, rulers gained divine approval through victory. Warriors followed strong leaders. Nobles supported victorious ones. Commoners revered kings who expanded the kingdom's borders. But here lies the paradox. War made a king powerful, yet it also put him in greatest danger. So kings loved war as an idea, a concept, a symbol of strength. But the practical act of fighting, the messy, brutal, unpredictable chaos of the front lines, was something they increasingly avoided as history progressed. But in the early days, this was not always so. In the beginning, many kings did fight, and the transition from warrior king to commanding king is one of the most important shifts in human political evolution. But to understand why kings moved away from the front lines, we must look at early examples of those who embraced battle personally, and the heavy price they paid. A glimpse of the warrior king era. Long before the regal courts of medieval Europe, before the bureaucratic dynasties of China, before the pharaohs sat on thrones of gold, kings were simply the strongest men in their tribes. Leadership was raw. Kings rose from heroism, not inheritance. They fought, bled, hunted, challenged rivals, and earned their kingship in the most primal arena, battle. In these early societies, a king who did not fight was no king at all. His authority came from personal strength. But as these societies grew, as tribes became chiefdoms and chiefdoms became early states, the responsibilities of rulers multiplied. A king who died in battle could plunge an entire society into chaos. Thus began the slow, cautious retreat from the front lines. But the transition was not smooth. Many warrior kings insisted on fighting anyway, and the consequences were often disastrous. One arrow, one spear, one fall from a horse, and everything could collapse. The turning point. When kings became too important to die. The birth of bureaucracy marked the turning point, when writing, taxation, administration, irrigation management, and large-scale agriculture entered human civilization. The role of the king became too vital to risk. Even by the time of ancient Mesopotamia, kings were already conducting rituals, appointing generals, managing temple networks, overseeing labor forces, planning construction projects. In such a society, the king's mind was more valuable than his sword. Frontline fighting became a liability, Generals could die, soldiers could die, nobles could die. But the king? The king could not. Thus, kings increasingly shifted their physical presence away from direct combat. They still led the army, but from behind, or even from atop a vantage point far from the killing zone. In ancient Egypt, for example, the pharaoh was depicted as a mighty warrior. But in reality, he often stayed behind the charging troops, surrounded by bodyguards. In ancient China, the Zhou and later imperial rulers rarely risked close combat at all. And in medieval Europe, the king's armor grew heavier, his guards more numerous, his battlefield position more secure, precisely because the kingdom could not afford to lose him. This transformation from frontline fighter to safeguarded commander will be the central theme of our documentary. But before we explore how kings across different civilizations altered their relationship to war, we must step deeper into the story. Because not all kings agreed with this shift. Some still hungered for battlefield glory, some believed they were invincible, and some paid the price. Yet even as kingdoms expanded and as bureaucrats scribbled on clay tablets or parchment rolls to keep the machinery of the realm turning, the king himself often found the battlefield irresistible. It is easy for us to look back and imagine these rulers as calculating strategists, sitting safely behind their armies, protected by layers of advisors and elite guards. But to many kings, the battlefield was not merely a place of danger. It was the very stage on which their legacy would be carved into the memory of their people. Glory was not an optional decoration of kingship. It was woven into the very foundation of their power. Imagine a king who ascends the throne young, full of fire, surrounded by older nobles who whisper that he owes his crown to their support. Imagine common soldiers looking at him with doubt, wondering whether he is made of the same iron as his ancestors. Imagine ambassadors from rival kingdoms smirking politely, sensing weakness in the new ruler. In such a world, the king was almost forced to prove himself, and no proof was stronger than leading the army into battle. Fear fades, memory does not. A king who charged at the front became a legend. A king who stayed behind could be mocked for generations. Thus began the intoxicating pull of personal valor. The king might know, intellectually, that his life was too precious to risk. His advisors might warn him, his generals might protest, his family might plead. Yet there was something inside the crown, some whisper of ancient tradition, that urged him forward. The ancient kings had fought in the front. Heroes of myth had slain monsters, stormed walls, faced impossible odds. The stories people told around fires belonged to warrior kings, not administrator kings. And so rulers across the world wrestled with this question: should they obey the demands of the throne or the demands of history? In many cases, the decision was made for them. Public expectation could be tyrannical. A king who refused to ride into battle could be accused of cowardice, even if he governed brilliantly. Nobles might lose confidence. Soldiers might hesitate to follow orders. Foreign rivals might interpret caution as weakness. And so, despite the risks, many kings chose to fight. Some did it out of pride, some out of desperation, some out of genuine courage. But all knew that a single misstep could end not only their lives, but the future of their kingdoms. Still, even in societies that celebrated warrior kings, the battlefield changed. Warfare itself evolved. Early conflicts had been small-scale, local, personal. A king could stand in the front because the front itself was small, a clash of tribes, a contest of elite warriors. But as armies grew in size, as formations became complex, as thousands of common soldiers replaced small bands of noble fighters, the king's physical presence became more symbolic than practical. He no longer needed to swing a sword to show leadership. He needed only to be seen. Even the bravest kings often positioned themselves slightly behind the vanguard, where they could be visible yet guarded. They could inspire without exposing themselves to every spear thrust. But some ignored this shift. They longed for the stories that would be told after their deaths. They wanted monuments carved in their honor, songs sung in taverns, myths woven into the identity of the nation. And for these kings, the battlefield was worth every risk. Alexander rode at the front because he believed himself destined for greatness. Richard the Lionheart fought fearlessly because he believed a king's soul was forged by combat. Scandinavian rulers hurled themselves into battles because in their culture, the king who died bravely was rewarded in the afterlife. Different motives, same outcome. The king stepped into the storm. What many kings failed to consider was that glory and death walked side by side. For every Alexander who survived, there were dozens of rulers who died too early, leaving their kingdoms fractured. Some died to stray arrows, some fell from horses, some were overwhelmed in the press of battle, unable to move beneath the bodies of their own men. Ancient chroniclers often tried to give these deaths a noble spin, describing them as heroic sacrifices. But the truth was far simpler. A kingdom lost its mind, its heart, and its symbol in a single moment. And the consequences could last generations. This tension between the yearning for glory and the necessity of survival shaped almost every ancient monarchy. Kings were taught to fight from a young age. They trained with swords and spears, rode horses, practiced archery. But they were also taught politics, diplomacy, astronomy, rituals, economics, law. Their lives were a never-ending attempt to balance the heroic ideal with the political reality, and it was not always easy. A king surrounded by veteran generals might hear whispers suggesting he was merely a boy playing at rulership. A king surrounded by poets and priests might hear whispers urging him to fulfill destiny. A king surrounded by enemies, foreign or domestic, might feel that victory in battle was the only way to silence the doubts that threatened his reign. And here emerges the great contradiction of ancient kingship. The king was both the most important life in the kingdom and the one most expected to risk that life. He was the sacred flame of the dynasty, yet he was also the warrior who must stride into danger. He was protected more than any other man, yet pressured more than any other to prove he did not need protection. It is in this contradiction that we find the true story of why kings sometimes fought on the front lines, and why ultimately most chose not to. Because as kingdoms became larger, more sophisticated, more dependent on long-term stability, the risk grew too great. A dead general could be replaced. A dead noble could be replaced. A dead king? That was another matter entirely. Succession disputes could ignite civil wars. Rival factions might seize the throne. Foreign enemies might attack, sensing weakness. The death of the king on the battlefield could become a spark that consumed everything. And so the tension continued, generation after generation. Kings who hungered for glory clashed with advisors who pleaded for caution. Some rulers defied those warnings and won great victories. Others defied them and died. And slowly, painfully, across centuries, societies learned a lesson written in blood. A king must lead, but he must not die. Now the question becomes, if kings gradually withdrew from the front lines, what new forms of leadership emerged? How did kings project strength without swinging a sword themselves? How did they command loyalty, inspire armies, and maintain the illusion or the truth of their own martial prowess? And how did different civilizations solve this problem in their own unique ways? These questions lead us directly into the next part of our story, where we will follow kings from different cultures as they redefine what it meant to be a leader in war without standing in the first rank. Some found new ways to appear brave. Some relied on ceremony, some on strategy, some on intimidation. Some even created entire mythologies that declared the king too divine to bleed. And with this transformation begins a new chapter in the evolution of kingship, a chapter that reshaped warfare, politics, and the very nature of power. But even as kings gradually stepped back from the direct clash of weapons, the world around them refused to relinquish the idea of the warrior king. A strange balance formed. Kings no longer wished to die in the chaos of the front lines, yet their people still expected them to embody courage, strength, and martial excellence. Thus emerged one of the most fascinating shifts in ancient leadership, the rise of symbolic warfare, where the king's presence on the battlefield mattered more than his physical participation in combat. Imagine a king riding onto the battlefield, not at the very front where spears clashed, but positioned safely behind several lines of elite guards. His armor gleaming, his banner flying high, his presence sent a clear message. The king is here. He watches, he commands, he inspires. Soldiers looked back and saw him, a reassuring figure, alive, visible, untouchable. Kings learned that courage did not always mean placing oneself in danger. Sometimes courage meant bearing the enormous burden of remaining alive. If he fell, morale collapsed, strategies unraveled, and whole armies could disintegrate. This shift was not sudden. It came slowly, shaped by centuries of bloodshed. Generals increasingly took the king's place in the front, becoming extensions of royal will. Advisors, tacticians, astrologers, and spies replaced the king's own instinct on the battlefield. The king no longer needed to swing a sword personally. He needed to choose the right moment, the right commander, the right formation, the right sacrifice. War became less about personal heroism and more about coordination, planning, and survival. Yet even as kings moved farther from direct combat, their people demanded stories. Songs needed heroes. Festivals needed victories. Religion needed symbols of divine approval. And so kings embraced a different role, the role of the heroic figure, carved into stone reliefs, sung in epic poems, painted onto palace walls. These images were exaggerated, idealized, sometimes entirely fictional. A king might have stood a mile behind the front lines, yet the court poets would describe him charging with unstoppable fury, scattering enemies with a single blow. Temples would display reliefs of the king, bow drawn, spear raised, crushing enemy armies beneath the wheels of his chariot. The people believed these stories because they wanted to believe them, because a king was more than a man. He was the vessel of national pride. This transformation can be seen vividly in Egypt, where pharaohs were portrayed smiting enemies in scenes of overwhelming might. Yet in reality, the pharaoh was heavily protected, surrounded by elite guards, and rarely in personal danger. In Mesopotamia, kings carved inscriptions boasting of single-handed victories, while their scribes quietly recorded the contributions of generals and professional soldiers. Even in China, where rulers occasionally took part in chariot warfare, the emperors of later dynasties became distant, almost godlike figures whose value lay not in physical strength but in cosmic legitimacy. But the shift away from personal combat was not merely cultural or symbolic. It was deeply practical. As kingdoms grew, wars became more complex. Battles were no longer simple clashes between small groups of warriors. They became enormous engagements requiring coordination, logistics, supply lines, engineering, and long-term planning. A king in the front could no longer observe the battlefield effectively. He needed a vantage point. He needed information. He needed the ability to retreat, regroup, and rethink. The throne demanded strategy, not physical sacrifice. Yet history is never uniform. Even as most kings stepped back, some continued to defy this new trend. There were rulers who refused to abandon the old ideal of personal heroism. They charged into battle out of stubborn pride, cultural pressure, or genuine belief in destiny. Some lived to be celebrated. Some died tragically, and their kingdoms with them. Consider the young king raised in a warrior culture, surrounded by elders who constantly reminded him that ancestors fought at the front. He might be told from childhood that valor is the foundation of kingship. When such a king ascends the throne, he feels compelled to prove himself. Even if advisors warn him, even if generals beg him to remain behind the lines, he rides forward anyway. Not because he believes he cannot die, but because he believes he cannot live without proving who he is. And so the battlefield becomes a test of identity. Kings ride ahead not because it is wise, but because they cannot bear the shame of caution. But with each king who falls, with each kingdom plunged into chaos, the lesson becomes clearer. Leadership requires endurance, not recklessness. Slowly, the world learns. Kings begin to adopt specialized armor, not for battle, but for ceremony. Their swords become symbols of authority rather than tools of war. The palace becomes the center of power, not the battlefield. They continue to train in martial arts, continue to practice archery, continue to sponsor warriors and military academies. But these are displays of strength, not demonstrations of battlefield necessity. Yet even as kings withdrew physically, they did not retreat psychologically. The passion for war still burned. For many rulers, war was not simply a duty. It was a grand stage of ambition. Conquest offered wealth, borders, glory, and security. Peace offered stability, but also stagnation. Thus, many kings continued to wage wars with zeal, even if they no longer swung the sword themselves. The thrill of victory remained intoxicating. The king might not fight at the front, but he sat at the center of decision-making, guiding armies across continents, orchestrating sieges, forging alliances, commanding from afar like a chess master shaping the board. What began as personal combat evolved into strategic dominion. Kings became less like warriors and more like architects of war, overseeing vast systems of logistics, diplomacy, and command. Their power extended far beyond the swing of a blade. They could starve enemies, outmaneuver them, manipulate them, bribe them, or crush them through overwhelming force. War had become too big for any single man to fight alone, and as this new reality took hold, kingship transformed. The king became the ultimate authority, the mind behind the army, the spirit of the nation. He no longer needed to risk his life on the front lines to command loyalty. His victories were measured not by personal kills, but by the stability of his reign, the expansion of his borders, the prosperity of his people. A king who survived, who built systems, who ensured the continuity of the dynasty, that was the true conqueror. Still, the old expectations never disappeared entirely. People continued to admire warrior kings. Stories of ancient heroes continued to shape cultural ideals. The king might stand safely behind his lines, but he was still dressed in armor, still holding a sword, still expected to embody courage. This delicate balance between reality and mythology shaped every royal court in the ancient world. And so we see a new figure emerge, a king who does not fight personally, but who appears always ready to fight. A king who does not bleed in front of his soldiers, but who ensures the soldiers believe he would, if absolutely necessary. A king who leads with presence, not with proximity to danger. This performance of bravery became a new form of power, one that preserved the king's life while satisfying the expectations of his people. Now we move deeper into this transformation. How did different civilizations shape kingship according to their own values? Why did some cultures cling longer to the warrior ideal, while others abandoned it early? How did religion, technology, geography, and politics reshape the role of kings in war? And most importantly, how did the removal of kings from the battlefield change the fate of nations? These questions open the path to the next chapter of our unfolding story, where we will explore the contrast between cultures that demanded warrior kings and those that sought divine rulers untouched by blood. As kingdoms expanded and societies became more intricate, the relationship between kings and warfare continued to evolve in fascinating ways. The separation between the king's body and the battlefield grew wider, yet the king's identity remained anchored to war. This paradox became one of the defining tensions of ancient rulership. People wanted their kings to be victorious, fearless, and powerful, but they also wanted them alive, stable, and capable of steering the realm. And so kings began to adapt their image in ways that aligned with cultural expectations while preserving their physical safety. Different civilizations developed different solutions to this challenge. Some placed extraordinary importance on ritual and divine symbolism, allowing kings to maintain an aura of supernatural strength without stepping foot into actual combat. Others developed complex military bureaucracies in which generals became the real battlefield leaders, while the king functioned as the strategic and spiritual head of war. And still others bridged both approaches, creating hybrid warrior-priest monarchs whose authority was both earthly and divine. To understand how kings came to be viewed as too valuable to risk in battle, one must first examine how ancient people interpreted the king's role in the universe. In many societies, the king was not merely a political leader. He was a cosmic instrument. His body symbolized the health of the kingdom. His decisions shaped the fate of both the living and the dead. If he died suddenly or violently, the stability of the natural world could be thrown into disorder. Harvests might fail, rivers might flood uncontrollably, enemies might invade, internal rebellions might flare. And because people so deeply believed in the sacred nature of kingship, the consequences of a king's death on the battlefield were considered not just political disasters, but cosmic ruptures. This belief shaped the policies of many royal courts. Advisors and priests knew that the king's death was not merely a personal tragedy. It was a catastrophe that could destroy the realm's legitimacy. If the king was chosen by the gods, then how could the gods allow him to fall in the mud like a common soldier? If the king's blood carried divine essence, how could it be spilled by an enemy soldier's blade? These questions led to a growing expectation that kings should not place themselves in positions where the divine could be ridiculed by reality. And so the king's role transitioned into that of a figure who commanded war through divine authority rather than personal strength. But the people still needed to believe in the king's valor. And so kings began to appear on the battlefield in highly staged, controlled ways. They rode in chariots surrounded by elite guards. They appeared on vantage points, dressed in ceremonial armor, directing movements from afar. They sometimes joined the battle only when the enemy was already retreating. These symbolic gestures reassured the people without jeopardizing the king's life. The king was seen, he was present. He blessed the troops. He inspired confidence, but he did not expose himself to unnecessary danger. In some cultures, however, this was not enough. Warriors wanted a king who bled with them. Nobles wanted a king who shared their risks. Enemies respected a king who could fight. And these expectations created pressure on rulers who wished to demonstrate their valor more actively. This tension was especially strong in societies where kingship emerged from tribal or clan-based warrior traditions. For example, in early Indo-European societies, leadership was earned through personal bravery rather than inherited through birth alone. A king who remained behind the lines risked appearing weak, and so these rulers often rode into battle surrounded by heavily armored companions whose primary task was not to win the battle, but to protect the king's life at any cost. Still, as these societies evolved into more complex states with large populations, the cost of losing a king became too great. The king's life was no longer his own. It belonged to the realm. Even the most warlike cultures eventually recognized this. So a compromise emerged. The king would fight only in carefully selected moments, moments that mattered symbolically rather than strategically. For example, a king might lead a ceremonial charge at the start of a battle and then retreat to safety once the armies were fully engaged. He might challenge an enemy champion to single combat only when that duel had political meaning. He might take part in the siege of a city only after the walls had already been breached. These staged moments allowed kings to demonstrate courage without risking the future of the kingdom. Nevertheless, the desire for real battlefield glory persisted in the hearts of many rulers. The myths of ancestors who fought bravely at the front continued to inspire kings who felt overshadowed by the great names of the past. A king might grow up hearing tales of legendary warriors and feel compelled to follow their example. And so the cycle repeated. Kings stepped onto the battlefield seeking immortality and sometimes found death. But death in battle did not always bring honor. Sometimes it brought chaos. Succession disputes erupted when kings died without clear heirs. Brothers, uncles, cousins, and generals fought for control. Civil wars broke out. Foreign invaders seized the opportunity to attack. The kingdom suffered far more from the king's death than from any military defeat he might have sustained alive. And over time, the elites who surrounded kings, nobles, priests, bureaucrats, developed a vested interest in ensuring the king's survival. They began to insist that the king's body be guarded as though it were the most important artifact in the kingdom, which in many ways it was. This shift created new political structures. Armies developed specialized royal guard units whose sole purpose was to protect the king at all times. These guards were sometimes selected from distant tribes or foreign mercenary groups to ensure their loyalty. The king traveled with layers of protection, both physical and symbolic. Even when he rode into battle, he was shielded by elite warriors trained to form nearly impenetrable barriers around him. Meanwhile, generals increasingly became the true architects of battlefield success. Their authority grew, sometimes so much that they threatened the king's power, but the king needed them to compensate for his own reduced presence in combat. In some places, this division of labor became formal. Kings appointed military commanders with specific titles and ranks, granting them authority over troop movements, strategies, and logistics. The king became the supreme commander in name and spirit, but the practical execution of war belonged to the professionals. This shift allowed armies to become more effective, more disciplined, and more organized. It also allowed kings to focus on diplomacy, administration, and governance, the long-term tasks that ultimately shape the strength of their realm. Yet the image of the warrior king did not disappear. It became mythologized. It moved from the battlefield into storytelling. Royal scribes recorded exaggerated battles where the king slew thousands. Poets composed epics celebrating the king's unmatched strength. Artists carved reliefs depicting the king crushing enemies. These images shaped public perception far more than battlefield reality. Even today, many of our historical images of kings come from these exaggerated depictions, not from the truth of how kings actually behaved. The transformation of kingship from warrior to commander was not uniform across the world, however. Different civilizations developed distinct approaches depending on their geography, religion, and political systems. Some clung fiercely to the warrior tradition, while others embraced bureaucratic or religious models of rulership that separated kings from physical combat entirely. And it is this diversity, the various ways cultures redefined kingship in relation to war, that we turn to next. As civilizations grew more complex, the meaning of kingship diverged in remarkable ways depending on landscape, belief systems, and the nature of warfare itself. Geography alone shaped how much a king could or should risk on the battlefield. In mountainous regions where battles were often small and guerrilla in nature, a king might be closer to the action, moving through narrow passes and commanding small elite forces. In vast plains, where armies numbered in the tens of thousands, the king became a distant overseer, relying on signals, runners, drums, flags, or smoke to communicate with his commanders. The terrain determined not only strategy, but the king's physical role in the danger. In river valley civilizations such as Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus, warfare often involved large bodies of troops organized in disciplined formations. Losing the king in such battles could instantly collapse an entire army. For generals, defeat meant disgrace. For a king, defeat meant the unraveling of the cosmic order. Thus, rulers in these regions found increasing value in coordinating battles from a safe vantage point. Instead of swinging a sword, they calculated supply routes, anticipated enemy movements, secured alliances, and managed morale. Their greatest weapon became information, not steel. Meanwhile, in cultures with strong heroic traditions, such as the early Greeks, Celts, and Germanic tribes, the king or chieftain was expected to prove his worth through personal bravery. Even as these societies later developed states and kingdoms, that heroic expectation lingered. A ruler who refused to fight risked being mocked by poets and warriors alike. But even here, change eventually arrived. The king might begin the battle, showing his courage in the eyes of the warriors, but soon withdrew to safer ground to ensure he could command the remaining phases. This shift often arose quietly without explicit acknowledgement, because admitting that the king should not risk himself too greatly could clash with cultural ideals of bravery. Yet it happened, slowly but surely, as traditions wrestled with the practical needs of governance. One of the most striking forces driving kings away from the front lines was religion. In some societies, the king was believed to be chosen directly by the gods. His bloodline was sacred. His body was not merely human, but a vessel of divine authority. To see such a figure wounded or killed by an enemy was not only politically disastrous, it was religiously unthinkable. It raised questions about divine favor, cosmic order, and the legitimacy of the entire system of rule. Priests in many cultures thus exerted pressure on kings to avoid unnecessary danger. If the king was the sun, the moon, or the axis of the world, then his injury could disrupt the balance of nature. Rituals demanded his safety. Ceremonies depended on his presence. Festivals required his blessings. And so religion itself built a protective wall around the king, shielding him from the brutal, unpredictable chaos of war. But warrior traditions persisted. A king might be divine, yet divinity did not erase human pride. The desire to be remembered as a hero remained strong in many rulers. Stories of legendary ancestors echoed through royal halls, urging kings to step into the legacy of those who came before. A young ruler, still feeling the uncertainty of early reign, might ride into a battle determined to prove himself equal to the great heroes. His advisors might protest, the priests might warn him of ill omens, but he would feel compelled by a force larger than rationality, the weight of history pressing upon his shoulders. Yet history shows that kings who personally fought were often remembered more for their dramatic deaths than their victories. When a king died in battle, the shockwaves rippled far beyond the battlefield. Generals scrambled to maintain order, soldiers panicked, noble factions plotted, foreign kingdoms mobilized. The enemy grew emboldened, borders shook, dynasties sometimes ended in the span of a single afternoon. Those consequences taught societies a painful lesson. A king's death was too costly for personal valor to justify. Over time, this understanding hardened into a principle. Kings lead, but they do not charge. And so kings began to adopt alternative ways to express heroism without endangering themselves. Instead of proving bravery through close combat, kings proved it through endurance, decision-making, and strategy. They demonstrated courage by standing firm in moments of crisis, by refusing to flee even when defeat seemed imminent, by rallying troops with their voice rather than their sword. This new form of heroism became more valued than reckless battlefield glory. A king who survived brought stability. A king who thought deeply brought prosperity. A king who commanded wisely brought victory. The royal court played a crucial role in shaping this redefinition of courage. Poets, historians, and chroniclers were employed not to describe war with accuracy, but to portray the king's actions in ways that aligned with cultural expectations. If the king did not fight at the front, the chronicler might emphasize how his presence inspired the troops. If he remained on a hill watching the battle, the story might speak of him overseeing the field like an eagle, directing forces with divine insight. If he delegated the fighting, the account might proclaim that the king's wisdom ensured victory. These narratives softened public perception over time, creating a gradual acceptance that kingship involved far more than swinging a weapon. Those chroniclers shaped memory itself. They ensured that future generations remembered kings not for their physical exploits, but for the symbolic weight they carried. Rulers became characters in national stories, their images larger than life, their deeds woven into myth. Even if a king never stepped beyond his protective guard during a battle, the stories might depict him slaying foes with unmatched ferocity. Such imagery was not deceitful in the cultural context. It was expected. Myth served a purpose. It strengthened identity, unity, and loyalty. A kingdom needed heroes, and if reality did not provide them, imagination filled the gap. Yet not all civilizations moved down the same path at the same speed. Some continued to expect their kings to lead from the front centuries after others had abandoned the practice. The reasons varied. In some cases, the geography favored small-scale warfare where the king's presence had a tangible effect. In others, warrior aristocracies demanded that leaders share their risks. In still others, kings lacked strong bureaucracies and thus relied on personal charisma to hold the realm together. These rulers often fought because they had no alternative. Their authority depended on martial prowess. But even in these societies, the trend eventually shifted. Kingship increasingly required diplomatic skill, administrative ability, and the long-term management of complex institutions. A king who died young could undo decades of progress, and so the elites, nobles, priests, advisors, merchants, slowly insisted on preserving the king's life. Their own fortunes depended on his survival. A stable king meant stable privilege. A fallen king meant unpredictable chaos. Thus, the very people who once demanded warrior kings became the ones who demanded protected kings. This evolution was not driven by weakness, but by wisdom. As states matured, they recognized that war was not a test of one man's strength, but the result of collective effort. Armies were built through taxes, storage systems, smithing industry, training, and command hierarchies. The king's role was to coordinate these systems, not to risk death in the press of bodies. Victory came from planning, not from personal heroics. Survival of the kingdom depended on continuity, not momentary courage. But something interesting happened as kings withdrew from the front. Generals grew more powerful. The men who actually fought, who won battles, who gained respect of the soldiers, began to accumulate influence. Some became threats. Some staged rebellions. Some founded dynasties of their own. The king had solved one problem, the danger of personal combat, but created another, ambitious commanders whose successes made them rivals. This too shaped the structure of kingship. To counterbalance powerful generals, kings developed spy networks, fostered loyalty through marriages, elevated trusted officers, and sometimes deliberately rotated commanders to prevent any from gaining too much popularity. The increasing distance between king and battlefield thus changed the internal politics of the realm. War remained central to power, but kings now fought political battles more than physical ones. The story of how different cultures navigated this challenge, how kings balanced authority, warfare, and stability while remaining far from direct danger, forms the next step in our journey. We now move from general evolution into concrete examples, exploring how specific regions developed unique traditions of kingship that shaped their attitudes toward war. As we move deeper into this evolution of kingship, the differences between civilizations become clearer. Each region, each people, each belief system shaped its rulers in distinctive ways, and these variations formed a spectrum. At one end, kings who led armies from the front like heroic champions. At the other, kings who were so sacred, so divine, or so politically essential that the idea of them entering danger bordered on absurdity. Between these extremes lay countless hybrid forms, influenced by culture, geography, religion, economics, and the character of the rulers themselves. To understand this spectrum, imagine standing at a crossroads of ancient history. On one path stands the warrior king, fearless, bloodied, inspiring through personal combat. On another stands the god king, untouched by warfare, ruling through ritual and cosmic legitimacy. A third holds the strategist king, who commands from afar, yet shapes battles through intellect. A fourth path shows the ceremonial king, whose martial presence is symbolic rather than practical. And all around these paths, countless variations swirl, each civilization selecting its model based on its needs and worldview. Let us begin by looking at cultures that clung fiercely to the warrior tradition. Early Greek and Homeric societies, for example, placed immense value on personal heroism. Kings were expected to be the bravest among their men, fighting in the front ranks. Agamemnon, Achilles, Menelaus. though more myth than history, reflected a culture that believed a leader must prove himself in combat. Even when Greece transitioned into classical city-states with more formalized military structures, the heroic ideal lingered. Kings in Sparta fought with their soldiers. Even in Macedon, where monarchs commanded vast armies, the reigning king was often found charging into battle on horseback, spear in hand. Such behavior earned respect, but it also led to death. One misplaced step, one lucky spear, one chaotic moment, and the king was gone. Contrast this with Egypt, where the pharaoh was a living god. Though reliefs showed pharaohs defeating armies alone, these were symbolic representations of cosmic order triumphing over chaos. In truth, pharaohs participated in war carefully, surrounded by elite guards and shielded from danger. Their presence mattered more as a ritual function than as a tactical one. The idea of a pharaoh dying in the melee would have shocked the ancient Egyptian worldview. The king upheld ma'at, divine balance. His death in battle would have thrown the universe into disarray. Thus, religion itself created a protective barrier between pharaoh and front lines. Mesopotamia offered yet another variation. Kings of Assyria often boasted of their martial prowess in inscriptions, depicting themselves as mighty warriors who struck fear into enemies. And indeed, some Assyrian kings were formidable commanders, but even they did not hurl themselves blindly into danger. As the empire grew and wars expanded in scale, kings increasingly remained behind fortified chariots or vantage points, directing battles through trained officers. The king's job was not to kill, but to command, not to fight, but to embody Assyrian might. His victories were those of the entire imperial system. Then we look eastward, toward ancient China, where kingship traveled its own unique path. During the early Zhou period, rulers sometimes took part in chariot warfare, fulfilling the warrior role expected of aristocrats. But as China transitioned into the warring states period and later into empire, the emperor became a figure far removed from physical combat. He was the son of heaven, responsible not only for ruling, but for maintaining harmony between heaven and earth. An emperor bleeding in battle would have signaled a cosmic imbalance. Philosophies like Confucianism later strengthened this view, emphasizing moral leadership, ritual propriety, and administrative competence over physical bravery. Generals rose in prominence, and the emperor ruled through them, not alongside them on the front lines. Step west again and enter Persia. The Achaemenid kings commanded vast multi-ethnic armies stretching across continents. Though some kings demonstrated battlefield bravery, their position at the center of a sprawling empire made them too important to risk recklessly. They often observed battles from elevated platforms, surrounded by the royal guard. Their presence inspired troops, but actual fighting was left to generals. The king was a symbol of imperial unity, and unity required survival. Travel farther and we encounter the Celts and Germanic tribes, where warrior kings remained common far longer. These cultures valued personal bravery and considered a leader's honor tied to his willingness to fight. Yet even here, as kingdoms grew and stabilized, the trend shifted. Kings who survived long enough to rule learned that their responsibilities extended far beyond the battlefield. They had to negotiate alliances, maintain order, and ensure continuity of leadership. Even the fiercest warrior kings eventually learned that stability required caution. Perhaps one of the greatest examples of this tension is found in Rome. In the early days, kings and later consuls fought in front lines, earning honor through bravery. But as Rome became a republic and later an empire, rulers increasingly distanced themselves from battle. Generals took command. Emperors focused on governance. The empire grew too vast for a ruler to risk his life in unpredictable combat. Still, emperors were expected to project an image of martial authority. Statues showed them in armor. Coins depicted them as victorious conquerors. Yet many had never drawn a sword in real battle. Image replaced reality. Symbol replaced action. It was not deception, but adaptation. Rome needed stability more than spectacle. Across all these civilizations, one pattern emerges. As states grew more complex, the demands placed upon kings changed. They were no longer merely warriors. They became administrators, diplomats, judges, priests, strategists, and symbols. Their responsibilities multiplied beyond anything that could be fulfilled by a man constantly risking his life. The kingdom became a machine, and the king its indispensable core. Lose the core, and the whole machine faltered. This transformation was not just political or practical, it was psychological. Kings began to see themselves differently. They no longer viewed personal combat as the highest form of leadership, but as a relic of simpler times. They valued longevity, legacy, planning, and stability. The idea of dying in the chaotic swirl of battle came to seem unnecessary, even foolish. Why gamble the future of a nation for the sake of personal valor? Why risk dynastic collapse for the thrill of a single moment? Yet even as kings withdrew from direct combat, the shadow of the warrior ideal remained. It whispered in stories, lingered in the expectations of soldiers, flickered in the minds of young princes raised on tales of heroic ancestors. Many kings struggled with it. Some embraced caution and were mocked. Some sought glory and died. Some tried to balance both, appearing brave while avoiding danger. This tension shaped not only kings, but entire systems of military organization. As kings stepped back, generals stepped forward. Armies grew more professional. Warfare became less about personal duels and more about formations, logistics, and discipline. Kings became strategic overseers, not frontline fighters. And as we move further, we will see how this shift reshaped the political landscape, how generals gained power, how courts became more intricate, how armies transformed, and how the idea of kingship itself evolved. Now we step into the next stage of this long story, how the king's distance from battle altered the internal dynamics of the kingdom, the rise of powerful generals, the dangers of military coups, and the delicate balancing act that rulers had to maintain to survive not just wars, but politics. As kings stepped farther from the front lines, a new and powerful force began to shape the destiny of kingdoms: the rise of the professional general. This development was inevitable. Once rulers ceased to risk their lives in the direct clash of battle, someone had to command the army, inspire the troops, and orchestrate the dynamics of warfare. This someone was almost always a general, a man of ability, ambition, charisma, and hard-earned experience. And the moment generals rose in importance, the political landscape around the king shifted dramatically. For the first time, the king was not the sole embodiment of martial power. He now shared it with men whose authority came not from divine right or noble birth, but from the love and fear of armies. This shift created both strength and danger. Strength because professional generals made armies more effective. Danger because these generals sometimes grew too powerful. A general who won victories became beloved by soldiers in a way the distant king rarely was. The men who shared hardship with him, who marched with him, who bled under his command, often saw him as the true leader of the military. Their loyalty to the king was abstract, ritualistic. Their loyalty to the general was immediate and emotional. A king thousands of miles away who issued commands from a palace could never match the bond between a general and his soldiers on the field. And so, as kings withdrew physically from war, they had to contend with a new reality: generals who could either secure or shatter the throne. This phenomenon appeared across civilizations. In imperial China, powerful generals sometimes held enough influence to threaten the emperor himself, prompting emperors to rotate military appointments or place eunuchs and trusted loyalists in key positions. In Mesopotamia, ambitious military leaders occasionally seized power, presenting themselves as liberators of the people. In Rome, this dynamic reached its explosive limit when the Republic collapsed under the weight of generals. Men like Julius Caesar, Pompey, and Sulla, whose battlefield popularity eclipsed that of the state. They commanded legions whose loyalty made them political giants, capable of shaping or destroying governments. Kings everywhere felt this pressure. They could not eliminate generals. They needed them. They could not allow them to gain too much power. They threatened royal authority. Thus, kings developed sophisticated systems to balance military leadership. Some created dual command structures so no single general held absolute authority. Some placed spies within the military ranks. Some used marriage alliances to tie generals to the royal family. Some lavished wealth and titles on them to maintain loyalty. And some, fearing betrayal, executed generals preemptively, eliminating potential rivals before they became dangerous. This fragile balance became a defining feature of ancient and medieval politics. The king's withdrawal from the front lines had made generals necessary. But necessity bred risk. It also bred complexity. Kings now fought wars on two fronts, one against external enemies, and one within the palace itself. An ambitious general could become a threat not because of malicious intent, but because of his competence and reputation. Success itself could be dangerous. But generals were not the only internal force reshaped by the king's absence from battle. The royal court struggled with the consequences as well. Advisors, priests, bureaucrats, and nobles grew more influential as kings spent more time governing and less time fighting. Their roles expanded, and their opinions shaped decisions that once might have been made on the battlefield. The court became a political battlefield, a place of intrigue, alliances, jealousy, and maneuvering. Powerful men and women competed for the king's trust, knowing that with the king's body removed from combat, control over his mind became the true path to power. This transformation created new political tensions. In some courts, factions emerged between military and civilian elites. Generals viewed courtiers as effeminate, soft, or overly cautious. Courtiers viewed generals as reckless, dangerous, or too close to the army. The king stood at the center of this rivalry, balancing the demands of war and governance. A weak king could be manipulated by either side. A strong king learned quickly that survival meant maintaining equilibrium. At the same time, armies changed. As kings withdrew, the professionalization of the military accelerated. Armies shifted from noble warriors seeking personal glory to disciplined soldiers trained to operate within large formations. Warfare became a matter of logistics, engineering, supply chains, and long-term campaigns. Soldiers no longer fought for a king's personal honor. They fought for pay, loyalty to their general, or the survival of the state. The king's presence in battle became symbolic rather than functional. His job was to ensure the army's existence, not to fight inside it. But let us not imagine that kings lost all connection to war. On the contrary, they became deeply involved in planning and strategy. Without the distraction of personal combat, they studied maps, consulted advisors, analyzed intelligence, and made complex decisions that shaped the battlefield long before swords crossed. Kings became architects of war rather than participants. They oversaw supply lines stretching across continents. They negotiated alliances and truces. They made choices that determined not just the outcome of battles, but the fate of generations. Yet the illusion of the warrior king did not disappear. Kings continued to wear armor, often specially designed ceremonial armor too ornate for real battle. They held weapons forged more as symbols than tools. They mounted horses during military parades, performed ritual acts of bravery, and participated in festivals and ceremonies designed to reinforce their martial legitimacy. Public appearances mattered. The people needed to see their king as strong, heroic, and capable, even if actual combat had been delegated to professionals. In some cultures, the symbolic role of the king became so entrenched that the people expected him to perform rituals of victory even if he never stepped onto a battlefield. Kings would ceremonially strike a captured enemy, shoot an arrow into the air, or participate in reenactments of battles. These acts connected the king to war without exposing him to risk. They reinforced the belief that the king was the source of victory, even if generals executed the practical work of war. And yet, for all this adaptation, tension always remained. Kings could not escape the shadow of warrior tradition entirely. They lived under the gaze of their ancestors, whose bravery was immortalized in stories. They faced the judgment of soldiers who valued courage. They confronted rivals who might use their absence from the battlefield as a political weapon. A king accused of cowardice risked rebellion or ridicule. Thus, even though kings stopped fighting at the front, they never stopped performing bravery. This performance took many forms. A king might ride close enough to the battle to be seen, but far enough to be protected. He might personally join a charge only after the enemy was already wavering. He might intervene in a duel that had been carefully arranged for his safety. These controlled demonstrations satisfied cultural expectations while preserving the king's life. Over time, people accepted these acts not as deception, but as necessary adaptations to the realities of empire. But there were exceptions, moments when kings found themselves in real danger despite their precautions. Ambushes, surprise attacks, unexpected battlefield developments, treachery, all could thrust a king into combat even if he had no intention of being there. And in those moments, history sometimes changed. A king who died in such circumstances could plunge his realm into chaos. A king who survived could become a legend. These moments remind us that even with layers of protection, kings could not escape the fundamental unpredictability of war. As kingdoms evolved further, the roles of kings and generals continued to grow more distinct. Kings became symbols and strategists. Generals became executors and field leaders. Armies shifted from aristocratic forces to professional institutions. Warfare moved from heroic duels to coordinated, large-scale operations. And through this ongoing evolution, the ancient question remained under the surface. Did kings withdraw from the front because they feared death, because they valued life, or because they understood something deeper? That the king's true battlefield was not the place of bloodshed, but the place of decisions, diplomacy, and destiny? Now we move forward into the next chapter of this story. How royal ideologies, sacred rituals, and the divine nature of kingship influenced their relationship to war, and how the idea of the king as a cosmic anchor ultimately transformed the role of rulers across civilizations. As the centuries unfolded, a profound transformation began to take place in the very idea of a king. What started as a chieftain leading warriors into battle gradually became a sacred figure whose existence was tied not only to politics and warfare, but to the rhythms of the cosmos itself. This shift was not abrupt, nor was it identical across regions, but it emerged from a universal human instinct, the desire to anchor society in something larger than life. And in many civilizations, that anchor became the king. When a king's role evolved from warrior to divine ruler, everything about his relationship with the battlefield changed. It was no longer simply a matter of personal danger. It was no longer about losing a commander or risking tactical disorganization. It became a spiritual issue, a cosmic threat. The king's life was seen as intertwined with the health of the land, the fertility of the soil, the yearly cycle of rains, the success of harvests. People began to believe that if the king fell, the balance of the universe might collapse with him. And so kings were increasingly treated not as heroic fighters, but as irreplaceable vessels of divine energy. This belief strengthened as societies grew more settled, more agricultural, more dependent on long-term stability. Early nomadic tribes could survive the death of a leader because new leaders could rise with relative ease. But settled civilizations, with complex bureaucracies, irrigation systems, religious institutions, and cities, could not afford the sudden shock of losing their ruler. Their entire social order was built around the king's identity. His death was not simply a vacancy, it was a fracture. Thus, as civilization deepened its roots, the king's presence in battle became increasingly symbolic, ritualistic, or ceremonial. One of the strongest examples of this evolution appears in ancient Egypt, where the pharaoh was believed to be the earthly manifestation of Horus, the son of Osiris. In this worldview, the pharaoh was not merely human. He was the bridge between the divine and the mortal realms. His responsibilities were cosmic in scale. He ensured the rising of the sun, the flooding of the Nile, the preservation of Ma'at, the eternal balance. For such a being to fall in battle would have implied that chaos had triumphed over order. The idea was unthinkable. So while pharaohs appeared in inscriptions smiting enemies, these depictions were symbolic. Their actual participation was carefully controlled. A similar sacred aura surrounded kings in other regions. In Southeast Asia, rulers were associated with Mount Meru, the cosmic center of the universe. In sub-Saharan kingdoms, kings were linked to ancestral spirits and believed to embody the soul of the nation. In Mesoamerica, rulers often played priestly roles, communicating with gods through ritual rather than combat. Everywhere this sacred dimension took root, kingship transformed from a warrior's duty into a spiritual stewardship. But divine kingship did not always remove the martial element. Sometimes it intensified it, in symbolic form. A king might be too sacred to risk, but he was also expected to embody supernatural victory. This produced a rich tapestry of rituals, ceremonies, and symbolic battles. Kings performed mock combats at festivals to represent the triumph of order over chaos. They ritually hunted animals symbolizing enemy nations. They prayed for victory, blessed armies, and participated in rites intended to secure divine favor before battles. In some cultures, kings shot the first ceremonial arrow of a campaign, after which the real fighting was carried out by generals and soldiers. These rituals acted as substitutes for actual frontline combat. They allowed kings to maintain their martial aura without risking the cosmic disaster of their death. And as these symbolic practices became ingrained, the people themselves gradually embraced them as legitimate expressions of royal bravery. Over generations, expectations changed. No one asked why the king did not personally fight. The answer was clear. His role was to maintain the universe, not to clash with swords in the midst of dust and blood. Yet kings were still humans, living with human emotions, desires, and ambitions. Some rulers struggled with the tension between their sacred role and the warrior traditions of their ancestors. In cultures where both divine kingship and heroic ideals coexisted, this tension could produce kings torn between caution and glory. They were expected to be wise, calm, and godlike, yet also courageous, strong, and victorious. To reconcile these demands, kings often appeared in armor during ceremonies, led parades of soldiers, trained in martial arts, and maintained personal warrior retinues, all to preserve the image of a warrior without the reality of reckless combat. Even in regions where divine kingship was not explicit, kingship still carried heavy ideological weight. For instance, in ancient India, kingship was tied to dharma, the cosmic law. A king was the protector of order, justice, and sacred duty. His death in battle was considered noble, yet also catastrophic for the kingdom. Thus, even though Indian warriors were famed for their bravery, kings increasingly relied on trained generals and war elephants while they directed battles from chariots or secure vantage points. In Japan, the emperor was considered a descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu, and thus too sacred to participate in war directly. Military power shifted to the shoguns, who fought in the emperor's name. This created a fascinating dual structure where the emperor held spiritual authority while generals held military authority, a clear expression of the king's removal from danger. But even when kings were divine, their kingdoms were not immune to the pressures of warfare. Enemies did not care about cosmic order. They sought territory, wealth, or revenge. And so kings needed armies, generals, fortifications, and strategies. They needed to win battles even if they themselves no longer fought in them. This practical necessity forced kings to develop new roles that replaced the physical presence they once provided. These roles included strategic leadership, diplomatic maneuvering, economic preparation for war, moral and symbolic inspiration. Kings became the minds behind wars rather than the bodies fighting them. They shaped campaigns through planning rather than direct action. They secured food supplies, negotiated alliances, chose battle locations, and managed the morale of armies and the public. Their values shifted from personal bravery to foresight and wisdom. Yet even with this shift, the king's symbolic presence remained vital. Armies needed to believe their ruler supported them. Religion often required the king's blessings before a campaign. Cultural expectations demanded some form of participation. Thus, kings appeared at the start of battles, rode among troops, oversaw mustering ceremonies, and offered prayers or speeches, then withdrew to a safe position. These appearances were not hollow gestures. They carried immense psychological power. Soldiers fought harder, believing their king watched over them. Enemies hesitated when they saw the royal banner. The king's presence, even at a distance, shaped the emotional landscape of battle. Some kings used this symbolic presence so effectively that they wielded influence far beyond any personal combat. Their words rallied armies. Their confidence signaled inevitability. Their survival became a source of national strength. The king's body, protected and sacred, became a living banner, representing continuity, destiny, and the identity of the realm. As divine and symbolic kingship deepened, another change followed: the emergence of complex court cultures. Advisors, priests, scribes, scholars, and bureaucrats gained power as kings focused more on governance and ritual. Courts became centers of learning, debate, intrigue, and strategy. Kings who once roamed battlefields now oversaw vast administrative networks that kept states alive. This shift reduced the importance of personal valor and elevated intelligence, wisdom, and political skill. Yet in every age, kings still contended with the shadow of their warrior ancestors. Even as divine kingship grew strong, the memory of earlier times, when leaders fought in the dust with spear and shield, lingered. Kings were aware of it, so were their rivals, so were their people. The tension between sacred authority and martial expectation became a quiet but constant force in royal psychology. We now move into an even more intriguing part of this story: the world of royal training, princely upbringing, and how kings learned from childhood that their bodies were not their own, that their lives were too important to risk, and that their relationship with war would always be complicated, both expected and forbidden. From the moment a prince was born, it was understood that his life did not belong solely to himself. He entered the world already wrapped in a web of expectations, hopes, and responsibilities woven by generations before him. Every gesture, every lesson, every breath carried weight. And among all these expectations, none was more complex than his relationship with war. He was raised to admire bravery, yet taught to fear recklessness. He was trained to fight, yet warned never to risk his life. He was shaped to be a king, yet reminded constantly that a king was too important to die in the dust of battle. To understand why kings withdrew from the front lines, we must understand how they were raised, how their identities were molded from childhood, how they learned that the battlefield was both theirs and not theirs, how the image of war surrounded them even as the reality of war receded. Royal training was rigorous and yet carefully controlled. A prince learned archery, swordsmanship, riding, athletics, and sometimes martial rituals or dances that symbolized combat. He practiced with trainers, sparred with guards, and watched demonstrations by elite soldiers. He was taught the mechanics of war: strategy, formations, logistics, morale. He learned to read maps, to interpret scouts' reports, to calculate marches and supplies. He was taught that a king must understand war completely, even if he would not stand in the first line of battle. But this training was more about leadership than personal combat. A prince's movements were monitored. His instructors were warned never to allow real danger. Even in childhood, princes were guarded from accidents that might injure or kill them. Their horses were carefully chosen. Their weapons were blunted. Their sparring partners were always elite soldiers capable of preventing catastrophic harm. A prince was raised on the edge of war, close enough to see it, far enough to avoid its teeth. At the same time, royal education emphasized ideals of valor and ancestral heroism. Princes memorized tales of legendary kings who fought bravely, who rescued their kingdoms, who stood firm against overwhelming odds. These stories were not simply entertainment, they were moral lessons designed to form character. A prince was told he must be courageous, decisive, noble, but he must also be wise, cautious, and mindful of his duty to survive. And so from childhood, he was thrust into a contradiction. He must embody martial excellence, yet must not risk himself like an ordinary warrior. As a prince aged, this contradiction grew sharper. When he became old enough to accompany armies, he often rode with the royal retinue, observing battles from secure vantage points or participating only in highly controlled moments. A prince might lead a charge only when the enemy was already breaking. He might practice archery on the battlefield's edges. He might walk among soldiers to raise morale. But always, guards formed a wall around him. His instructors, now generals, reminded him that bravery was expected, but death was forbidden. In some cultures, this protective attitude intensified as the prince approached adulthood. If he was the only heir, the caution became extreme. Every illness, every fall from a horse, every minor injury produced panic among courtiers. A prince might be disciplined harshly for taking unnecessary risks. His companions might be punished for allowing him too much freedom. Even the physical space around him changed. Fewer steps, fewer stairs, fewer chances for accidents. The prince became a living treasure, guarded not just by soldiers, but by an entire worldview. Yet princes themselves were not always happy with this arrangement. Many grew restless, craving the freedom and exhilaration of real combat. They watched the soldiers train and longed to join them. They heard tales of bravery and wished to create their own, and some, when they eventually became kings, carried this frustration into their reign, leading them to fight despite the risks. These were the kings whose names became legendary, but who often died early, leaving their realms weakened or shattered. But most princes accepted their sacred burden. They learned that courage could take forms other than physical danger. They learned that commanding men required composure more than ferocity, foresight more than strength. A prince was taught that the king's true battlefield was the mind, the place where decisions shaped destinies. He learned that the survival of the realm depended not on a single heroic act but on years of wise governance. The training of a prince also involved diplomacy. He watched negotiations, studied alliances, listened to advisors debate policy. He learned the subtleties of court life, the importance of managing factions, the dangers of ambition. These lessons were essential. A king who died in battle was a tragedy, but a king who mismanaged politics was often far worse. Princes understood early that their survival alone was not enough. They needed the skill to steer the complicated machinery of the kingdom. Yet even as royal education emphasized caution, the cultural memory of warrior ancestors lingered powerfully. A prince had to walk a tightrope between two worlds, the old heroic ideal and the new political reality. He was expected to be a warrior in spirit, yet a ruler in practice. This dual expectation shaped kingship for millennia. It created rulers who dressed in armor for ceremonies, who trained with weapons to maintain an image, who sat on war councils with the authority of seasoned commanders even if they had never swung a sword in true danger. And still, princes were taught one lesson above all: the king must not fall. This lesson came from history itself. Princes learned about kingdoms thrown into chaos when a king died unexpectedly. They heard tales of succession crises, civil wars, invasions triggered by a ruler's death. They learned that an enemy needed only one lucky shot, one stray arrow, to bring down a dynasty. These cautionary tales shaped their behavior more firmly than any lecture. When princes saw how fragile kingdoms truly were, they understood why their bodies had become precious objects of statecraft. Through royal upbringing, future kings absorbed the idea that their lives were symbols of continuity. Their survival was a political necessity, a religious mandate, and a cultural expectation. This understanding influenced every decision they made once they ascended the throne. Even if they admired warriors, even if they longed for glory, even if their hearts pulled them toward the front lines, their training reminded them that dying in battle would bring ruin far beyond themselves. Thus, the upbringing of princes, the sheltered training, the ceremonial martial practices, the ideological lessons, the strict protection, all contributed to the gradual removal of kings from frontline combat. They became rulers who understood war intimately but experienced it from distance, who performed bravery without embracing recklessness, who inspired armies by their presence rather than by their participation. And this upbringing had another profound consequence. It created kings who viewed their own mortality differently. A king became less concerned with personal heroism and more concerned with legacy, governance, and the future of the realm. His mind turned toward long-term plans, alliances, reforms, and stability. War became a tool of policy rather than a proving ground of physical strength. The king, raised from birth to preserve his life, naturally gravitated toward roles that kept him alive, not out of fear, but out of responsibility. Now we take this understanding further, exploring how kings built elaborate systems of protection around themselves. Royal guards, fortified camps, battlefield protocols, and how these measures made it nearly impossible for kings to participate directly in the chaos of the front lines. As kings began to see their own bodies as instruments of continuity and symbols of the realm, elaborate systems arose around them to prevent even the slightest chance of harm. These systems were not built in a day. They emerged from centuries of trial and error, shaped by the deaths of reckless rulers, refined by political necessity, and sanctified by ritual. By the time many civilizations reached their mature stages, the protection of the king had become an institution unto itself, vast, disciplined, and sophisticated enough to function almost independently of the monarch it guarded. At the heart of this protective structure was the royal guard. This was no ordinary group of soldiers. It was an elite corps, trained to a degree far beyond regular troops, bound by strict codes of loyalty, and often isolated socially from the rest of the army. Their purpose was singular: ensure the survival of the king. Unlike typical warriors who sought glory or advancement, guards found their honor in protection. Their training was built around defending a single life, not winning battles. They learned to form human shields, to detect threats before others noticed them, to move in perfect unison around the king's body. In many cultures, these guards were chosen through rigorous selection processes, sometimes from foreign peoples with no ties to local political factions, ensuring they had no loyalties except to the king. The existence of such a guard made it nearly impossible for a king to enter frontline combat. Even if he desired it, his protectors would physically restrain him from reckless behavior. Their loyalty was absolute, not optional. If the king rode forward, they rode ahead. If he charged, they formed a living wall around him. If he attempted to fight, they blocked him from entering danger. In effect, the royal guard became a buffer not only between the king and enemies, but between the king and his own impulses. Many kings, frustrated by the limitations imposed upon them, found themselves arguing with their own protectors. Yet the guards rarely compromised. They were not servants of the king's wishes. They were servants of the king's survival. Surrounding the guard was a larger protective system shaped by policy and logistics. Kings rarely traveled alone. When they moved with armies, they occupied heavily secured positions. Command tents at the rear, fortified chariots, raised platforms guarded by multiple rings of soldiers. Their camps were fortified first, supplied first, scouted first. Engineers built trenches, walls, and barriers specifically to safeguard the royal position. Messengers and scouts brought constant updates so that the king could observe the battle without stepping into its chaos. Even battlefield etiquette adapted to these needs. Many kings established formal protocols dictating how close they could approach the front. Some cultures designated specific distances. A king could not cross a particular boundary unless the battle was already heavily in his favor. Others instructed generals to withdraw the king if the tide turned. These unwritten rules gradually acquired the force of law, shaping expectations across generations. Even in moments of crisis, kings were removed from danger before ordinary soldiers were. His survival mattered more than any tactical moment. This protective infrastructure created an environment in which kings increasingly functioned as high-level overseers. From secure vantage points, they watched the flow of battle, interpreted signals, communicated through flags, runners, or drums, and adjusted their strategies according to unfolding events. They became observers and conductors rather than participants. While soldiers fought in dust and blood, kings navigated the war from positions designed not for combat, but for clarity. The elevated view gave them insight into the battle's broader shape, something impossible for frontline warriors who saw only what lay immediately before them. This distance also strengthened the trend toward professional military leadership. Generals, far more mobile and adaptable on the battlefield, made tactical decisions that once may have belonged to the king. The monarch focused on the grand picture, how battles fit into campaigns, how campaigns fit into diplomacy, and how diplomacy shaped the fate of the kingdom. The king became the strategist-in-chief rather than the warrior-in-chief. The battlefield remained under his authority, yet no longer under his feet. And yet, despite all this protection, appearances still mattered. The king needed to be seen by soldiers, by nobles, by allies, and by enemies. To hide entirely behind fortifications would have damaged morale. Soldiers wanted to believe their ruler stood with them. Enemies needed to believe he had the courage to appear on the battlefield. Nobles needed to know he did not fear warfare. Thus, kings often positioned themselves just close enough to danger to maintain legitimacy, but far enough to remain effectively untouchable. It was a delicate balance, rehearsed and refined until it became second nature. In many cultures, rituals developed around this controlled exposure. Before battles, kings reviewed troops, rode along the lines, and delivered speeches. They stood on platforms near the army's center, visible to thousands of soldiers. Their banners flew prominently so that all could look to them for reassurance. Priests conducted ceremonies invoking divine favor at the king's side. These actions stitched the king symbolically into the fabric of battle, even if he would not personally enter the fray. Yet even with layers of protection, kings sometimes found themselves in unintended danger. Ambushes could spring unexpectedly, enemy cavalry might break through lines, or the tide of battle could shift too quickly for guards to respond. When this happened, the king's life hung in the balance, and history shifted dramatically. Some kings survived, earning legendary reputations. Others died, plunging their kingdoms into mourning and turmoil. These rare incidents reinforced the importance of keeping the king safe and pushed future rulers even farther from the battlefield. The long-term consequences of this trend were profound. As kings became less involved in actual combat, the identity of kingship itself transformed. Rulers became administrators, lawgivers, builders of states. They devoted more time to courts, diplomacy, infrastructure, and religion. Their power became less about brute strength and more about the mastery of systems. A king's hand no longer wielded a sword. It signed decrees, presided over ceremonies, and directed the machinery of government. But perhaps the most important consequence was psychological. Once kings were protected so thoroughly, society began to see their bodies in a different way. They were no longer individuals. They were institutions. Their lives represented the continuity of the realm. Their death represented collapse, uncertainty, and vulnerability. This perception created a collective anxiety around the idea of a king risking himself. Even common people who once admired kings who fought at the front began to resent rulers who put themselves in unnecessary danger. The fear of losing stability overshadowed the admiration for personal bravery. Slowly but surely, the heroic image of the warrior king faded from reality and entered legend. Kings still posed in armor, warriors still surrounded their thrones, and the language of battle remained embedded in royal symbolism. But in practice, kings had become something else entirely. Figures whose strength lay not in physical combat, but in strategic vision and political endurance. Now, having understood how protection reshaped kingship, we turn to another crucial element in this historical evolution: how the changing nature of warfare itself, new weapons, new formations, new tactics, made it increasingly impractical, even impossible, for kings to fight at the front. As armies grew larger and battles more sophisticated, the king's place shifted naturally from the chaos of combat to the realm of command. As warfare evolved, it reshaped not only armies and strategies, but the very position of the king within battle. What had once been a world of personal duels, small skirmishes, and heroic charges gradually transformed into vast, orchestrated engagements requiring split-second decisions, communication systems, and precise coordination between thousands, sometimes tens of thousands, of soldiers. In such an environment, the king's physical presence in the front lines became not only dangerous but increasingly impractical. The battlefield had outgrown the idea of a single heroic figure charging with a spear. War had become too complex for kings to participate as warriors. They had to become commanders instead. To understand this transformation, imagine standing on a battlefield in the earliest eras, when war was a direct confrontation of individuals and small groups. Leaders fought at the front because the battle was small enough for their presence to make a psychological difference. Soldiers fought by watching their chieftain's actions. If he advanced, they advanced. If he fell, they fled. Battles were decided by the courage and skill of a few elite warriors. In this world, the king's presence at the front made sense. His valor could turn the tide. But as civilizations developed agriculture, writing, taxation, and infrastructure, armies grew enormously. War became an organized institution, not a personal contest. By the time of mature ancient states, battles were fought by thousands arranged in formations so tightly structured that an individual warrior, even a king, could affect only a tiny portion of the field. The era of the lone hero began to fade. With this came new weapons that further pushed kings away from danger. The invention of long-range missile technologies, composite bows, powerful slings, early siege engines, meant a king could be struck long before he reached the enemy lines. Skilled archers could target banners and distinctive armor, making kings primary targets whether they carried a weapon or not. The battlefield became a place where a single unseen projectile could decide the fate of a nation. This vulnerability forced kings to reconsider their traditional roles. A warrior king was no longer a leader. He was a liability. Then came the era of cavalry, which made warfare faster and more chaotic. Horses reshaped combat in ways that limited a king's control over events. Cavalry charges could shatter lines, creating unpredictable movements. A king caught in the midst of this might be surrounded, cut off from his command structure, or swept away in the tide of battle. A single mistake, a single miscommunication, could lead to disaster. Kings learned that their place was where they could see the whole field, not where they could be trampled beneath hooves. Infantry formations also grew more sophisticated. Phalanxes, shield walls, disciplined ranks. These formations required precise timing and coordination. Leaders needed to signal retreats, reinforcements, flanking maneuvers, changes in formation. A king fighting at the front could not issue such commands effectively. He would see only the fighting before him, unaware of the wider picture. The chaos of close combat blinded him to developments on other parts of the field. Generals standing on hills or command platforms could observe the battlefield as a whole. Kings on the front line could not. Thus, kings gradually ceded tactical control to professional commanders. Siege warfare added yet another layer of complexity. Battles were no longer swift clashes but prolonged operations requiring engineering, logistics, and patience. Kings overseeing sieges needed to manage supply lines, negotiate with allies, monitor enemy reinforcements, and maintain discipline among restless troops. None of these tasks could be accomplished if the king placed himself at the front, where danger was highest and information was lowest. The demands of siege warfare favored rulers who commanded from behind, not warriors who fought at the front. Even religion and ritual adapted to these new realities. As warfare grew more complex, Religious ceremonies surrounding war shifted from emphasizing brute courage to emphasizing divine strategy and ordained victory. Kings participated by offering sacrifices, consulting oracles, or performing symbolic acts of war, while generals and soldiers took on the actual fighting. The spiritual purpose of kingship thus aligned with the practical necessities of warfare, reinforcing the king's removal from danger. Furthermore, the development of intelligence networks changed how kings interacted with battle. Scouts, spies, coded messages, and messengers provided information that allowed rulers to plan long-term strategies. Kings who understood intelligence could win wars without ever stepping foot on a battlefield. They manipulated alliances, anticipated enemy movements, and used information to weaken opponents. War became a chessboard, and the king its grand master, not one of the pieces thrown into the melee. As war expanded, communication became crucial. A king at the front risked losing contact with his commanders. Even if he survived combat, he might be unable to issue timely orders. Battles moved too quickly and covered too much space for a single man, however brave, to manage them personally. Command tents filled with maps, runners, and strategists became the true heart of battlefield leadership. Kings learned that they led best through coordination, not combat. Yet even as warfare forced kings to withdraw, societies never fully abandoned the image of the warrior king. Kings continued to train in martial arts, wear armor during ceremonies, and appear before troops in displays of strength. These were powerful psychological tools. Soldiers still needed assurance that their king understood their world. Nobles still expected the king to maintain the dignity of his warrior lineage. Enemies still reacted to the symbolic presence of the royal figure. And so kings balanced the realities of modern warfare with the expectations of tradition. In many ways, the king became two people at once, a ceremonial warrior and a practical commander. He wielded the sword in ritual, but the pen in strategy. He wore armor before battle, but sat behind defenses during it. He appeared at the head of parades, but not atop the walls during sieges. This dual identity allowed kings to satisfy both their people's longing for heroic leadership and the practical demands of governance. Occasionally, the old warrior spirit resurfaced. A king might ride closer to the fighting than necessary, might join a charge to inspire troops, might duel an enemy leader in a symbolic confrontation. But these moments were rare, often calculated, and usually surrounded by layers of protection. The king's participation in battle had become an act of controlled theater, not physical necessity. By the time warfare reached its later ancient and medieval forms, the king's absence from the front was so normal that it required no justification. Soldiers expected to be led by generals. Courtiers expected the king to remain safe. The people expected continuity, not recklessness. And kings, raised from childhood with this expectation, accepted their role as symbols of unity rather than champions of personal combat. Now, with the evolution of warfare understood, we turn to the final piece of this puzzle. How kings themselves rationalized this transition, how they shaped ideology, myth, and royal identity to justify their absence from the front, and how this ultimately created the modern concept of rulership and military leadership. As the long arc of history carried kings farther from the dust and blood of the front lines, rulers faced a final challenge, one not of swords, armies, or politics, but of perception. People are rooted in tradition. They remember stories more vividly than facts. They cling to the image of the warrior king even when the world has changed beyond recognition. And so kings, stepping away from direct combat, needed to construct a new identity that preserved the dignity of kingship while reflecting the realities of a sophisticated, structured state. This was not merely propaganda, it was an evolution of meaning. Kingship itself had to be redefined. Rulers began with a simple idea. If they could not be warriors in person, they would be warriors in spirit. They adopted the imagery of martial power, armor, swords, helmets, banners, not because they intended to use these objects in battle, but because symbols carry emotional weight. A king dressed in armor embodied bravery even if he never raised a blade. The sight reassured soldiers, pleased nobles, and calmed the public. It told a story: the king is ready, the king is strong, the king stands with us. And this story mattered far more than where the king actually positioned himself on the battlefield. The next step was ideological. Kings began presenting themselves not as fighters, but as protectors, guardians of the realm. They argued that their survival was itself an act of courage, because it ensured continuity and stability. Instead of proving valor through personal combat, they proved it by making difficult decisions that affected thousands, sometimes millions. They redefined bravery as responsibility, wisdom, and endurance. A king who kept the kingdom intact through diplomacy, reforms, alliances, and strategic vision became a hero in a new and powerful sense. War was no longer a place for individual glory. It was a tool of statecraft. This ideological shift produced a new kind of narrative. Chroniclers wrote of kings whose intellect saved armies, whose foresight prevented invasion, whose speeches inspired victory. Even when the king did not wield weapons, histories portrayed him as the architect of triumph. The spotlight shifted from his physical actions to his strategic mind. Kings embraced this evolution. They commissioned works of art, monuments, poems, and inscriptions emphasizing their divine guidance, their wisdom, and their ability to maintain order. Over time, the people accepted this new vision. The king was no longer simply a warrior. He was the embodiment of stability. But even as kings distanced themselves from combat, they never fully abandoned the language of heroism. They retained martial titles. They performed rituals representing conquest. They led victory parades. They reviewed armies and blessed banners. They continued to speak of themselves as the center of military power, even if they delegated the execution of war to generals. In this way, kingship preserved the emotional aura of the warrior ideal while adapting to the demands of a complex political world. A critical part of this transformation was the construction of myth. Kings began to root their authority not in personal combat, but in divine will, ancestral destiny, and the cosmic order. The message was simple. The king does not fight because he is too important to risk. He is the chosen one, the axis on which the world turns. His life maintains balance, ensures prosperity, and secures the future. To endanger him is to endanger everything. This myth was not forced upon people. They willingly embraced it because it gave meaning and order to their world. And so divine kingship, once a belief, became a justification. A king protected by gods or cosmic law could not be expected to fight like a common soldier. His power was spiritual rather than physical. His victories were won through divine favor, not personal skill. This idea reinforced the king's distance from danger and made it seem not cowardly but sacred. The battlefield belonged to mortals. The king belonged to eternity. As ideology evolved, kings also reshaped legal and administrative systems to support their new role. The king became the supreme judge, the guarantor of justice, the source of law. He became the face of diplomacy, receiving ambassadors, negotiating treaties, and managing relations with other states. He became the economic center, overseeing taxation, trade, irrigation, currency, and infrastructure. In short, the king's responsibilities expanded so greatly that personal participation in battle became inefficient and counterproductive. The kingdom needed his voice more than his sword. Generals, now firmly established as battlefield leaders, carried the burden of combat. Their victories brought glory to the king. Their failures were judged by him. Their loyalty sustained the throne. This division of labor eventually shaped the modern distinction between political leadership and military command, a division still visible today in most nations. The king had become a ruler in the true sense, not a warrior with a crown. Yet the memory of the warrior king never fully vanished. It lingered in epic tales, national legends, and cultural identity. Even as people accepted that kings no longer fought, they continued to celebrate ancient heroes who did. And kings, aware of this lingering expectation, often adopted symbolic gestures to connect themselves to the past. They commissioned sculptures depicting them in heroic poses, even if those poses bore little resemblance to reality. They named themselves after legendary ancestors. They performed ritual hunts, symbolic battles, or ceremonial challenges meant to echo the deeds of old. This connection to the warrior past served an important purpose. It reminded people that the king, though distant from battle, still embodied courage. It allowed societies to honor both tradition and evolution, preserving identity while embracing practicality. In the end, kings withdrew from the front lines, not because they lacked bravery, nor because they failed in their duties. They withdrew because the world changed, and because they understood that true leadership required survival. They adapted because the future of their kingdoms depended on their ability to govern, not on their willingness to bleed. They evolved from warriors into strategists, from fighters into symbols, from heroes into institutions. And that is the true answer to the question that guided this entire documentary. Why didn't kings in ancient times fight in the front lines? Because the king was more than a warrior. He was the living embodiment of the state. Its anchor, its symbol, its heartbeat. His death meant far more than the loss of one man. It meant the unraveling of stability itself. War changed, kingdoms changed, kingship changed. And through that change, rulers discovered a new kind of heroism, not forged in the clash of swords, but in the quiet endurance of responsibility. Thus, the story ends, not with a king charging into battle, but with a king standing above it, guiding, commanding, protecting, ensuring that while warriors fell, the kingdom endured.